Emotions have a functional value. They help to facilitate our relationships. They provide like a channel for us to communicate our most basic needs and desires. They help to guide our behavior as well. In general, emotions help us just adapt to changing situations. They'll prepare your body to take action if you're under threat. They will signal to other people when you are happy with what they've done, when you appreciate what they've done, but also when you don't appreciate it. That allows them to pick up on those emotional cues and respond accordingly. If you think about it, emotions are fundamental for relationships. If we didn't have these ways of expressing our needs and desires in very simple to understand ways, then there'd probably be a whole lot more conflict around the world. But emotions aren't just about relationships and communicating our needs. Relationships are also just about preparing ourselves to take action in really basic kinds of ways. Like, I'm sure you've heard the term hangry, when you're angry because you're hungry. This, if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, this actually has a significant purpose. Try to imagine yourself as, living in ancient times. You're out in the middle of the wilderness, you haven't eaten for days, and your hunt is just not going too well. When you see a cute bunny hop by at this point, you're probably not going to think about how cute and friendly it seems. You're probably going to think something along the lines of, I'm going to kill that bunny. Like, you're upset because you're so hungry, right? Like, it prepares your body to take the actions that you need to take to survive. So emotions are functional in that regard. But typically, when we talk about the research about emotions, we're talking about how we express them and how we understand them. So it's all about this facilitation of relationship. And when it comes to what the basic different forms of emotions are, we have the following. There's joy, anger, sadness, distress, disgust, interest, surprise, and fear. So there's 8 basic emotions. Obviously, they can combine to form more complex feelings, but these are the basis for all emotional feelings that you can have. And you can see all 8 of these in children by the time they're about 6 months of age. So before 6 months of age, they will only have some of the most basic of all. Like newborns, they only show basic signs of pleasure and distress. Those other ones come later. By about 2 to 3 months of age, they'll start showing signs of happiness in the form of social smile. This is a smile produced when they see a human face. Sometimes it's accompanied by like a cooing sound. And then later on, between the 4th and 6th months of age, that's when they start to develop their more negative emotions like anger, disgust, and fear. This seems to reflect an increasing understanding of their personal goals and the frustrations that impede those goals. Now, those more negative emotions, and the positive ones too, they can be combined in various ways to form more complex feelings. Like, for example, a 6-month-old, it's around that time that they'll typically start showing signs of stranger wariness. Fear of strangers, signs of fear that emerge when the infant is in the presence of unfamiliar adults. So that kind of fear has a very clear functional value. This child needs to be around their primary caregivers because those are the ones that are most likely going to protect them and take care of them. And this is adaptive. It prevents the child from wandering away from those parents. But an interesting thing about this is as children become more aware of emotions and they become better able at handling relationships, stranger wariness will fade, especially if the individual seems to be friendly. So an older child, like a 2-year-old, for example, if somebody is attractive, that's important if they're physically attractive, and if they're friendly and kind, they can oftentimes convince that infant to go with them. So fear, in the form of the stranger wariness, adapts at about 6 months of age and develops in that pattern. Other negative emotions like disgust aren't as well understood. Exactly how this manifests and how it changes over time, it basically seems to be the result of mimicry. So these children see parents react to disgust and then they just copy that pattern of behavior. So this also seems to have a clear functional value. If parents show that certain things should not be done, like you shouldn't eat certain things, you shouldn't go certain places, if parents show signs of disgust towards these kinds of harmful stimuli, then that will obviously protect the child from that harm. So mimicking the parents is a very good thing for their health and well-being. But it's those more complex emotions that come a bit later. Emotions like guilt and embarrassment and pride. In order for a child to really be able to, understand these feelings, they have to first of all understand themselves. They need to become self-aware first. And as we were talking about in a previous video, this kind of self-awareness doesn't really start to manifest until they're getting close to 2 years of age. Somewhere between 15 to 18 months is when we first start seeing signs of this kind of self-awareness. And then those complex emotions develop shortly after that. Like we typically see them manifest at about 18 to 24 months, but it can vary from child to child. The most important thing though is self-awareness comes first. But emotional expressions are a completely different subject. There's a lot of interesting research that's done just on how we express our emotions and use these expressions to communicate our needs and desires. It seems as though emotional expressions have evolved as a way to communicate our feelings to others. Like I was talking about earlier, it helps to facilitate our relationships. And as a result, many basic and more complex emotions can be understood around the world. So here are these universal emotional expressions. You've got, from the top left to the bottom right, you've got anger, fear, disgust, surprise, happiness, and sadness. But I don't think I needed to actually tell you that. I'm sure you were able to understand what that expression is showing. And I should be able to take this image and show it to basically anyone, and they would be able to understand what these emotions mean, what these expressions mean. So emotional expressions do seem to be universal in that regard, but there are some interesting differences from one culture to the next. We've done a lot of cross-cultural studies that have noticed in some cases, pretty substantial differences. For example, in a lot of Asian cultures, children are encouraged to show restraint, especially when it comes to those negative emotions of sadness, anger, and fear. They're just supposed to not be as expressive. Whereas European American children are typically, encouraged to express themselves in various ways, to be more independent, to be more assertive, to let their desires be known. So we've done, just as an example of one study, we've done studies where we took 11-month-old European Americans and 11-month-old Chinese Americans, and we noticed that the European American ones cried and smiled more often, substantially more often. So that's just one interesting cultural difference, but there's many. These cultural differences can be really complicated. Like I said, in Asian cultures, generally you're supposed to repress your emotions, but there are certain cases where you're supposed to be exceptionally expressive. Like if, for example, you are guilty of some great offense, they expect you to be exceptionally expressive, to express exactly how deep your sadness and regret is in that particular context. And they do it to an extent that just would seem bizarre to somebody who's not from that culture. The amount of emotion that's being poured out in these situations just doesn't seem normal in their culture. But the whole point of expressing these emotions, regardless of how the culture has shaped it, is to communicate. And by about 4 to 6 months of age, infants can tell the difference between basic emotional expressions like happiness, sadness, and fear. Like they will instinctively seem to understand what these things mean, what these facial expressions mean. And over time, this gets more nuanced, and they get better at recognizing various facial expressions. And then by the time they get to about 12 to 14 months of age, that's when they start taking it to the next level and engaging in what we call social referencing. So this refers to a behavior where the infants, when they're put into an unfamiliar or an ambiguous situation, they will look to an adult. And typically they prefer to look towards their caregiver, their primary caregivers, but they'll look toward the adult in the room to see how they should feel. So if they don't know how to feel and mommy seems to be smiling, then they'll smile too and they'll be okay with it. But if mommy shows signs of fear or disgust, they'll recoil in fear or disgust. So they're basically mimicking the emotions they see and learning as a result, how to interpret these kinds of ambiguous situations. And when they get a bit older, they become even more skilled at recognizing emotions and seeing how those emotions interact with other people's emotions. And they learn in that kind of vicarious manner. They learn how one adult's emotional expressions can cause a reaction in another, and that will guide their behavior. So just in general, as time goes on, they just get better and better at recognizing emotions and learning from those emotions. Now, that's the typical pattern we see, but some children learn faster than others. That's normal for pretty much any domain. Some children just pick up these emotional understandings much quicker than others. But there are certain things you could do to help your child learn how to understand other people's emotions and their own emotions at a much faster rate. Like, for example, parents should talk with their child about the child's emotions. They should frequently discuss past emotions. Talk about what triggered those emotions, why these emotions are important, like what these emotions mean. So just talking about the child's own emotions in the past is really important. Another one is they can explain how things in the environment can trigger certain emotions. So what situations can elicit fearful reactions or happy reactions. And then another thing that parents could do is just model good, healthy relationship skills. If parents are emotionally expressive towards each other, they show a lot of positivity, and they show the kind of, healthy relationship, then that will help to develop the child's understanding of how emotions are supposed to work in a much more simple way, simply through observation.